The lone shot from a Colt revolver echoed through the Willow Creek Valley as Madeline Lawson ran for her life, her heart pounding against her ribs like a frightened bird. The Wyoming Territory of 1878 was unforgiving to women alone, and at 22, she had just become the most alone she had ever been. "Keep running, Miss Lawson," she whispered to herself. The memory of her father's lifeless body sprawled in their homestead cabin still fresh in her mind. The bank had finally made good on their threats, sending men to collect what her father couldn't pay. She hadn't expected them to use bullets instead of words. The sun beat down mercilessly as Madeline's boots pounded against the dry earth. Her dark brown hair had come loose from its pins, and tears streaked her dust-covered face. The town of Silver Ridge lay somewhere ahead, her only hope for sanctuary now that everything she'd ever known was gone. Behind her, hoofbeats thundered. Madeline's breath caught in her throat as she veered off the trail, scrambling down an embankment toward a thicket of scrub brush. Her worn blue dress snagged on branches as she crouched, pressing herself into the earth. "Where'd she go?" a gruff voice called out. "Boss wants her found before sundown." "She couldn't have gotten far," another replied. "Girls got nowhere to run to." Madeline pressed a hand over her mouth to stifle her breathing. They were right, she had nowhere to go. No family, no friends. Just the deed to a worthless plot of land that had cost her father everything. And now, his life. The riders moved on after a time, but Madeline remained hidden until the shadows lengthened across the valley. Only when the first stars appeared did she dare continue her journey, keeping to the shadows, a woman alone in a land that devoured the weak. By midnight, the distant lights of Silver Ridge appeared like fireflies on the horizon. Madeline's legs trembled with exhaustion, her throat parched from thirst. The town wasn't much a collection of wooden buildings straddling the stagecoach route, but it represented her only chance at survival. As she approached the edge of town, a figure emerged from the darkness. Madeline gasped, stumbling backward, her hand reaching for the small knife tucked in her boot, the only protection her father had given her besides his warnings about men and their intentions. "Whoa there," a deep voice called out. "You all right, madam?" The man stepped into a patch of moonlight, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette. A cowboy, by the look of his hat and the way he carried himself. In one hand, he held the reins of a magnificent chestnut mare, in the other, a Winchester rifle that made Madeline's blood run cold. "Stay back," she warned, brandishing the knife with a shaking hand. The man stopped, raising his free hand slowly. "No harm intended. Not many women walk into town alone at this hour without trouble following." His voice was rich and smooth like honey poured over rough stones. "I can handle myself," Madeline lied, even as her knees threatened to buckle beneath her. "I don't doubt it," the man replied, his tone suggesting otherwise. "Name's Mason James. I work the Diamond J Ranch outside of town." He tilted his hat slightly. "And you might be," Madeline hesitated. Giving her name could be dangerous if those men were still looking for her. But standing alone in the dark with a stranger seemed equally perilous. "Madeline," she finally said, omitting her surname, "I'm looking for work." Mason James studied her for a long moment, his face partially hidden by the shadow of his hat. "Well, Madeline, you look like you could use a meal and a safe place to rest first. My employer's wife might be able to help with both." "Why would you help me?" Madeline asked, suspicion edging her voice. Her father had taught her that nothing in this world came without a price, especially kindness from men. "Because someone once did the same for me," Mason answered simply. "And because those men who rode through town an hour ago asking about a young woman named Lawson didn't strike me as having honorable intentions." Madeline's breath caught. You know who I am. I know you're running from something, Mason corrected. And in my experience, people usually have their reasons. He offered the reins of his horse. You can ride. I'll walk beside you. Everything Madeline had ever learned told her not to trust this stranger. But exhaustion and hunger clouded her judgment, and the alternative, continuing alone into a town where men were already searching for her, seemed worse than accepting his help. "Where are we going?" she asked, reluctantly taking the reins. "Diamond J Ranch. It's about 3 miles outside town. The owner, Jackson Diamond, is a good man. His wife Elizabeth runs the household. They've been known to help folks in need." Madeline allowed Mason to help her mount the horse, his strong hands respectful as they steadied her. As they moved away from town, she cast one last glance at the lights of Silver Ridge. Whatever fate awaited her at the Diamond J, she prayed it would be kinder than what she'd left behind. The journey to the ranch passed in silence, with Mason leading the horse along a well-worn trail that wound through stands of pine and across shallow creek beds. Madeline fought to stay alert, but exhaustion pulled at her like quicksand. Several times, she nearly slipped from the saddle, only to feel Mason's hand steadying her. "Almost there," he assured her as they crested a small rise. The Diamond J spread out before them in the moonlight, a collection of buildings nestled in a protected valley. The main house stood 2 stories tall, an impressive structure for these parts, with a wide porch wrapping around it. Several smaller cabins dotted the property, and a large barn dominated the eastern edge. As they approached, a dog began to bark, followed by the glow of a lantern on the porch. A figure stepped out, rifle in hand. "Who goes there?" a woman's voice called out. "It's Mason, Mrs. Diamond. I've brought someone who needs help." The woman lowered her rifle as they drew closer. She was tall and straight-backed, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun. She wore a nightdress and robe, but carried herself with the authority of someone who commanded respect regardless of her attire. "Another stray, Mason?" she asked, but there was no malice in her tone, only weary resignation. "This is Madeline. She's in some trouble." Elizabeth Diamond's sharp eyes assessed Madeline from head to toe. "Aren't they all?" she murmured. Then, more loudly, "Come inside, girl. You look dead on your feet." Madeline slid from the horse with Mason's assistance, her legs nearly giving way as they touched solid ground. The world tilted alarmingly, and she might have fallen if Mason hadn't caught her arm. "When did you last eat?" Elizabeth asked, noticing how Madeline swayed. "Yesterday morning," Madeline admitted. "Before." She couldn't finish the sentence. Elizabeth's expression softened slightly. "Mason, see to your horse, then fetch some of that stew from supper. I'll get our guest settled." Inside, the Diamond house was modest but comfortable. Elizabeth led Madeline to a small room off the kitchen that held a narrow bed, a washstand, and little else. "This is our help's quarters, but we haven't had a girl since spring. You can wash up here." She pointed to a pitcher and basin. "I'll find you something clean to wear." When Elizabeth left, Madeline sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden kindness after her harrowing day. She hadn't expected to survive the night, let alone find shelter. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying wouldn't bring her father back or solve her problems. She managed to wash her face and hands before Elizabeth returned with a simple cotton nightdress and a bowl of stew carried by Mason, who respectfully kept his eyes averted. "Eat, then rest," Elizabeth instructed. "We'll talk in the morning." When they left her alone, Madeline devoured the stew, barely tasting it in her hunger. The bed, though narrow, felt like heaven after her ordeal. As she drifted toward sleep, the last thing she remembered was the sound of low voices from the kitchen, Mason explaining something in urgent tones, and Elizabeth's measured responses. She should have been frightened, alone in a strange house with people she didn't know. Instead, exhaustion claimed her, and Madeline fell into the deepest sleep she'd had since her father first fell ill months ago. Morning came with the sound of activity pots clanging, voices calling, the distant lowing of cattle. Madeline woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day crashed back into her consciousness. Her father was dead. Men were hunting her. She was alone in the world. A knock at the door roused her fully. Mrs. Diamond says breakfast is ready if you're feeling up to it. A young voice called, not Mason's, but a boy's. Madeline found her dress from yesterday washed and folded at the foot of her bed, alongside a simple cream-colored blouse she didn't recognize. After dressing quickly, she followed the smell of coffee and bacon to the kitchen. The room was larger than she expected, dominated by a long table where several men already sat eating. They fell silent as she entered, all eyes turning toward her. Madeline felt her cheeks flush under their scrutiny. "There she is," Elizabeth said briskly, gesturing to an empty chair. "Sit and eat. Men, this is Madeline. She'll be staying with us for a time. I expect you all to show her the same respect you'd show your own sisters." The men ranch hands. Madeline assumed nodded and murmured greetings before returning to their food. Only one continued watching her with undisguised curiosity. A boy of perhaps 16, with a shock of red hair and freckles scattered across his sunburned face. "That's Timothy," Elizabeth explained, setting a plate loaded with eggs and bacon before Madeline. "He helps in the house when he's not working with the horses." Madeline nodded at the boy, who grinned in response. "Mason says you ran all the way from Willow Creek," he said. "That's more than 15 miles. Timothy," Elizabeth warned. "Our guest doesn't need to recount her journey before she's even had her coffee." Madeline gratefully accepted the steaming cup Elizabeth offered. As she ate, she glanced around for Mason but didn't see him among the men at the table. "Mr. James rode into town at first light," Elizabeth said, noticing her searching gaze. "He had some business to attend to." Something in the woman's tone made Madeline uneasy. "Mrs. Diamond, I don't want to bring trouble to your home. Those men who are looking for me will find nothing but buckshot if they come sniffing around here," interrupted a deep voice from the doorway. A tall man with silver-streaked dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard entered the kitchen. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, though his eyes held a kindness that softened his otherwise imposing presence. "Jackson Diamond," he introduced himself, extending a weathered hand to Madeline. "My wife tells me you're in need of sanctuary." Madeline hesitated before accepting his handshake. "I don't want to impose nonsense," Jackson cut in. "The Diamond J has always been a haven for those who need it. Mason explained your situation. I'm sorry about your father." Madeline blinked back sudden tears. "Thank you," she managed. "The bank had no right sending gunmen," Jackson continued, his expression darkening. "First National's been pushing folks off their land all across the territory. Your father isn't the first to stand against them." "You knew my father?" Madeline asked, surprised. "Of him," Jackson clarified. "Thomas Lawson had a reputation as an honest man. Hard worker. Proud, too, I expect. Too proud to ask for help when the drought took his crops." Madeline nodded, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. Her father had been proud, too proud to admit they were losing everything. Too stubborn to seek assistance even as illness weakened him and their situation grew desperate. "What will happen to our land?" she finally asked. Jackson exchanged a glance with his wife. "That depends on whether you can prove your father's death wasn't an accident. If those bank men murdered him, they can't legally claim the property." "But I have no proof," Madeline said, despair washing over her. It's my word against theirs. Perhaps, Elizabeth interjected, but Mason is looking into it. He has connections in town. If there's evidence to be found, he'll find it. Madeline was silent, processing this information. Mason James, a man she'd met only hours ago, was investigating her father's death. Why would he take such a risk for a stranger? In the meantime, Elizabeth continued, you'll stay here. We can use an extra pair of hands with the house if you're willing to work. Of course, Madeline agreed quickly. I can cook, clean, mend, whatever you need. Jackson nodded approvingly. Good. That's settled then. He turned to the ranch hands who had been quietly listening. The rest of you have chores waiting. Those cattle won't drive themselves to the north pasture. The men rose, tipping their hats respectfully to Elizabeth and Madeline before filing out. Only Timothy lingered, clearly hoping to hear more about the newcomer. You too, Timothy, Elizabeth said firmly. Those horses won't groom themselves either. The boy sighed dramatically but obeyed, casting one last curious glance at Madeline before leaving. When they were alone, Elizabeth began clearing the table. You can help me with the washing up, then I'll show you what needs doing around the house. As they worked side by side, Madeline found herself wondering about Mason James. Mrs. Diamond, may I ask about Mr. James? He seems different from the other ranch hands. Elizabeth's hands paused momentarily in the soapy water. Mason has been with us for 5 years. He came to us much like you did, in trouble, needing sanctuary. Jackson saw something in him worth saving. She resumed washing. He's our foreman now, and the most loyal man I know. If he's taken an interest in your situation, you can trust him completely. Madeline absorbed this, noting what Elizabeth hadn't said as much as what she had. There was a story there, perhaps one similar to her own. Now, Elizabeth said, changing the subject, let's talk about your duties here. I expect you'll want to earn your keep, and I could use help with the mending and preserving. The men go through clothes faster than I can patch them, and the garden's producing more than I can put up alone. For the rest of the morning, Madeline worked alongside Elizabeth, grateful for the distraction of physical labor. The routine of domestic tasks soothed her raw nerves, allowing her to momentarily set aside her grief and fear. By midday, she had mended 3 shirts, helped preserve a batch of peaches, and begun learning the rhythms of the Diamond J household. It wasn't until late afternoon that the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. From the window where she sat darning socks, Madeline could see Mason returning, accompanied by another rider. Her heart lurched with fear until she realized it wasn't one of the men who had pursued her. Elizabeth, she called. Mr. James has returned with someone. Elizabeth joined her at the window, her expression tightening as she recognized the visitor. That's Sheriff Caldwell from Silver Ridge. You'd best let me do the talking. Madeline's hands trembled as she set aside her mending. Are they here for me? Not if I have anything to say about it, Elizabeth replied grimly. Wait here. Madeline couldn't bring herself to obey. Instead, she moved to the kitchen where she could hear the conversation on the porch without being immediately visible. Afternoon, Sheriff, Elizabeth greeted, her tone carefully neutral. What brings you out to the Diamond J, Mrs. Diamond? The sheriff responded, his voice carrying clearly. I'm looking for a young woman who might have come this way. Madeline Lawson. There's been some trouble over in Willow Creek. What kind of trouble? Elizabeth asked. Her father was found dead yesterday. Bank representatives claim they went to serve an eviction notice and he attacked them. They're saying it was self-defense. Madeline bit her knuckle to keep from crying out. Self-defense. Her father had been bedridden for weeks before his death, too weak to lift his own rifle. That's so, Mason's voice now skeptical and hard. Funny how Thomas Lawson was known to be ailing these past months. Not exactly the type to attack two healthy men. I'm just telling you what I was told, James, the sheriff replied, a defensive edge to his voice. First National Bank is offering a reward for information on the daughter's whereabouts. They're claiming she stole some documents before fleeing. Documents? Elizabeth asked. Deeds, I understand. Property papers. Madeline's mind raced. The only papers she'd taken were her father's journal and the deed to their land papers that rightfully belonged to her. And why would a bank be so interested in finding a young woman who's just lost her father? Mason asked. Seems to me they'd be more concerned with claiming the land. There was a pause before the sheriff answered. Look, I'm just doing my job. If you see her, I'd appreciate you letting me know. For her own safety, of course. Of course, Elizabeth replied, her tone making it clear she believed nothing of the sort. Will that be all, Sheriff? One more thing. These bank men, they're not the patient type. They've hired some men to track her down. Professional trackers. It might be better for everyone if she came forward voluntarily. I'll keep that in mind, Elizabeth said coolly. Good day, Sheriff. Madeline retreated deeper into the kitchen as Elizabeth returned inside, her face tight with worry. You heard? Elizabeth asked, spotting her. Madeline nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Those bank men are lying, Mason said as he entered, removing his hat. His expression was thunderous. Your father was murdered, Madeline, and they want you silenced before you can tell anyone. But why? Madeline managed. Our land isn't worth killing for. Mason and Elizabeth exchanged glances. Maybe it is, Mason said slowly. I heard rumors in town. The railroad's planning a new spur line that would connect to the main track. Your father's land sits right where they'd need to build. Madeline stared at him, the implications slowly dawning on her. So the bank forecloses, sells to the railroad at a profit. And no one asks questions because it all looks legal on paper, Mason finished. Except your father wouldn't leave, and now they need to find whatever evidence you might have taken. My father's journal, Madeline whispered. He documented everything: the bank's threats, the railroad surveyors trespassing on our land. He was suspicious when the bank suddenly called in our loan. Where is it now? Elizabeth asked urgently. Madeline hesitated, still uncertain how much to trust these people despite their kindness. Hidden. In my things. Get it, Mason instructed. If what you say is true, that journal might be the only thing keeping you alive right now. As Madeline retrieved the worn leather journal from where she'd concealed it in the lining of her skirt, a new fear took hold. She wasn't just running from her father's killers. She was the only person who could expose their scheme, and they wouldn't stop until they found her. Mason carefully turned the pages of Thomas Lawson's journal, his expression growing darker with each entry he read. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows as they pieced together the conspiracy that had led to murder. Your father was thorough, Mason said, pausing at a detailed account of a meeting with bank representatives. He names everyone involved: the bank president, the railroad agent who offered to buy the land at half its value, even the date they first threatened foreclosure. He was always meticulous, Madeline replied, a bittersweet pride in her voice. Said a man's records were as important as his word. Elizabeth leaned forward, scanning the page Mason had open. This entry from 3 weeks ago, the one about the night visitors. He suspected they were poisoning your well, Madeline nodded grimly. Father fell ill shortly after that. The doctor said it was consumption, but Father never believed it. He stopped drinking the well water, started collecting rainwater instead. He seemed to improve for a while, but then... Her voice trailed off. Then they decided more direct methods were needed, Mason finished, his jaw tight with anger. These men aren't just land grabbers, they're cold-blooded killers. What can we do? Madeline asked, desperation edging her voice. No one will take the word of a homesteader's daughter over the banks. The journal helps, Mason said, but you're right, we need more. We need to catch them in a lie, force them to reveal themselves. Elizabeth frowned. That sounds dangerous, Mason. These aren't ordinary criminals we're dealing with. They have money and influence. All the more reason they need to be stopped, Mason insisted. How many other homesteaders have they forced out? How many other accidents have happened that no one questioned? A heavy silence fell over the kitchen as they contemplated the enormity of what they faced. Madeline felt a curious mixture of terror and determination. For the first time since her father's death, she had allies, people who believed her, who were willing to help fight an injustice that had seemed too big to confront alone. Jackson should be back from the North Pasture by sundown, Elizabeth finally said. We'll discuss this with him. He has connections in the territorial capital, friends in the governor's office who might help. Mason nodded, but his expression remained troubled. The problem is time. Those trackers the sheriff mentioned won't waste any searching for Madeline. If they're who I think they are, they'll find this place soon enough. Then we need a plan before they do, Elizabeth stated firmly. She turned to Madeline. In the meantime, you'll stay out of sight. No going outdoors, no showing yourself at windows. As far as anyone passing by is concerned, you're not here. Madeline agreed, though the thought of being confined to the house chafed. She wasn't accustomed to hiding. Her father had raised her to stand tall and face challenges head-on. But she understood the necessity. She was no good to anyone dead. As evening approached, Elizabeth busied herself preparing supper while Mason went to confer with the ranch hands. Left alone with her thoughts, Madeline found herself drawn to the window despite Elizabeth's warning, gazing out at the sprawling ranch that had become her unlikely sanctuary. The Diamond J was larger than she'd realized in the darkness of the previous night. Beyond the main house and outbuildings stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed, and beyond those, rolling hills that eventually gave way to distant mountains. It was beautiful country, the kind her father had dreamed of cultivating before drought and debt crushed those dreams. Movement near the barn caught her attention. Mason was there, deep in conversation with several ranch hands. Even from a distance, his presence commanded respect. The men listened intently as he spoke, nodding occasionally. One, a broad-shouldered man with a distinctive limp, seemed to be arguing, but Mason's response, though Madeline couldn't hear it, appeared to settle the matter. She found herself studying Mason with newfound curiosity. In the daylight, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly where it met his collar. His features were strong, with a square jaw often set in determination and eyes that missed nothing. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. Yet there was a watchfulness to him, as though he expected trouble to arrive at any moment. What had brought him to the Diamond J 5 years ago? What trouble had he been running from that made him understand her situation so intuitively? Madeline realized she knew almost nothing about the man who had possibly saved her life. He's a good man, Elizabeth's voice startled her. One of the best I've known. Madeline stepped back from the window, embarrassed to be caught staring. I was just wondering about him. Elizabeth smiled slightly as she continued kneading dough for biscuits. Most women do. Mason keeps to himself, though, doesn't share much about his past. You said he came here in trouble. Elizabeth's hands paused briefly. That's his story to tell if he chooses to. What I will say is that Mason understands what it means to be hunted, to have nowhere to turn. It's why he stopped to help you last night when others might have looked the other way. Before Madeline could ask more, the kitchen door opened and Jackson Diamond entered, removing his hat and gloves. His expression was grim as he took in the scene: his wife preparing supper, Madeline by the window, and the journal open on the table. "Mason filled me in," he said without preamble. "I was afraid something like this might happen. First National's been getting bolder with each passing month." "Can you help?" Madeline asked directly. Jackson's weathered face softened slightly. "I can try. I've known Judge Harris in Cheyenne for 20 years. If anyone will listen to accusations against the bank, it's him. But we need solid evidence, something more than your father's journal, important as it is." "What about the deed?" Elizabeth suggested. "Madeline, you said you took it when you fled." Madeline nodded, retrieving the document from where she'd hidden it with the journal. The deed to the Lawson homestead was a simple document, yellowed with age but still legally binding. Jackson examined it carefully. "This could be significant. According to this, your father paid off the original mortgage 5 years ago. If the bank was threatening foreclosure, they were doing so fraudulently." "Father always said we owned our land free and clear," Madeline confirmed. "The drought made things difficult, but we had no debts. It wasn't until 3 months ago that the bank suddenly claimed we did." "A falsified debt," Mason said from the doorway, having entered silently during their conversation. "Created to force your father off the land when he wouldn't sell." Jackson nodded grimly. "It fits their pattern. They've done similar things to at least 4 other homesteaders in the territory that I know of. The question is how to prove it," Elizabeth said pragmatically, returning to her biscuits. "A dead man's journal and his daughter's word against a powerful bank won't get far in most courts." "Unless we can get someone from the bank to confess," Mason suggested, his tone deceptively casual. Jackson shot him a warning look. "Whatever you're thinking, Mason, be careful. These men have already killed once." "I'm always careful," Mason replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But sometimes risks need to be taken." Madeline looked between the two men, sensing an unspoken tension. "What are you suggesting, Mr. James?" "I'm suggesting we set a trap," Mason answered, meeting her gaze directly. "Using the one thing they want more than anything." "The deed," Madeline realized. "And you," Mason added quietly. "They need to believe you're willing to negotiate, to trade the deed and your silence for your safety." "Absolutely not," Elizabeth interjected sharply. "We are not using this girl as bait for murderers." "It wouldn't be real," Mason assured her. "Madeline would be protected at all times. We just need to make them think she's vulnerable, get them to reveal their scheme." "And how exactly would that work?" Jackson asked, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. Mason laid out his plan as they gathered around the table. It was audacious, risky, but if successful, would expose the bank's criminal activities and clear Madeline's name. By the time he finished speaking, even Elizabeth had fallen silent, considering the possibilities. "It could work," Jackson finally said, "but everything would have to go perfectly. One mistake and—" "I'll do it," Madeline declared, cutting through their deliberation. "This is my fight. My father's murder. I won't hide while others take risks on my behalf." Mason studied her with newfound respect. "It won't be easy. You'll have to face the men who killed your father." "Good," Madeline replied, a steely determination hardening her voice. "I want to look them in the eyes when they realize they've lost." The kitchen fell silent as the others absorbed her resolve. In that moment, something shifted in how they saw her, no longer just a woman in need of protection, but a formidable ally in their fight against injustice. "Well then," Elizabeth said after a moment, turning back to her stove, "if we're planning to outsmart murderers, we'll need our strength. Supper's almost ready." As they ate, They refined Mason's plan, identifying potential pitfalls and solutions. Jackson would leave for Cheyenne at first light to speak with Judge Harris and arrange for legal documentation they would need. Mason would scout the bankmen's movements in Silver Ridge, determining the best location for their trap. And Madeline would prepare herself for the most difficult performance of her life. That night, lying in the narrow bed in the helps' quarters, Madeline found sleep elusive. Her mind raced with possibilities, both hopeful and terrifying. The plan could work, or it could end with more bloodshed. Either way, there was no turning back now. She had committed herself to a dangerous course, one that would either bring justice for her father or lead to her own destruction. Outside her window, the vast Wyoming night spread its star-filled canopy over the Diamond J Ranch. Somewhere in that darkness, Mason James stood watch, a silent sentinel protecting those under his care. The thought brought Madeline an unexpected comfort as she finally drifted toward sleep. Whatever tomorrow brought, she was no longer facing it alone. The next 3 days passed in a flurry of preparation. Jackson departed for Cheyenne as planned, carrying Thomas Lawson's journal and copies of the deed as evidence for Judge Harris. Mason made daily trips to Silver Ridge, gathering intelligence on the bankmen's movements and spreading careful rumors about a young woman seeking passage on the eastbound stage. Madeline remained hidden at the ranch, but far from idle. Under Elizabeth's watchful eye, she practiced the role she would need to play: a frightened, desperate woman willing to negotiate away her future to save her life. It wasn't entirely an act. The fear was real enough. But Elizabeth insisted that controlling that fear, channeling it into convincing performance, would be essential to their success. Men like these bank fellows see women as weak, Elizabeth explained as they sat mending on the second afternoon. They expect tears, pleading, easy manipulation. You must appear to fulfill those expectations while remaining clear-headed. How did you become so knowledgeable about deception, Mrs. Diamond? Madeline asked, curious about the steely woman who had taken her in. Elizabeth's hand stilled momentarily. I wasn't always a rancher's wife. Before I met Jackson, I worked in a gambling house in St. Louis. Not as a sporting woman, she added quickly, seeing Madeline's expression. I dealt cards, learned to read men's intentions to spot liars and cheats. A small smile touched her lips. Useful skills for a woman alone in the world. Is that how you met Mr. Diamond? In St. Louis? Lord, no. I'd left that life behind by then. Was working as a teacher in Kansas when Jackson came through with a cattle drive. One look at him, and I knew my teaching days were numbered. Elizabeth's expression softened with the memory. Sometimes a person just knows when they've found where they belong. Madeline considered this as she stitched a tear in one of Jackson's shirts. She'd never experienced such certainty. Her life had been one of duty and obligation, caring for her father, working their land, surviving one season to the next. The idea of belonging somewhere with someone, by choice rather than circumstance, seemed like a luxury beyond imagining. What about you? Elizabeth asked, breaking into her thoughts. Did you leave anyone special behind in Willow Creek? Madeline shook her head. There was no time for such things. Father needed me, especially after he fell ill. And before that, a flush crept up Madeline's neck. There was a boy once, the blacksmith's son. He talked of marriage, but Father didn't approve. Said I was too young, that we couldn't afford to lose my help on the farm. She sighed. Mark married the mercantile owner's daughter instead. They have 3 children now. Elizabeth studied her thoughtfully. Your father loved you, I'm sure, but he shouldn't have kept you from living your own life. 22 is well past the age most women are already wives and mothers. It wasn't just Father, Madeline admitted quietly. I was afraid. Marriage means giving yourself completely to another person's care, trusting them with your happiness, your future. After watching my mother die when I was young, seeing how it destroyed father inside, I wasn't sure I could bear that kind of love or deserve it. Elizabeth's eyes softened with understanding. Oh, child, love isn't something you earn or deserve. It's a gift freely given. And yes, it comes with risk, terrible risk. But the alternative is a half-life, never knowing what might have been. Madeline had no response to this. Her entire world had been upended in the span of days. Contemplating love and its possibilities seemed an indulgence she couldn't afford. Yet as evening approached and Mason returned from town, she found herself watching him with new awareness, noting the grace of his movements, the quiet authority in his voice as he reported what he'd learned. The bank president, Harrington, arrived from Cheyenne today, Mason told them over supper. He's staying at the Silver Ridge Hotel with those two men who have been asking about you. They've hired 3 more gunmen, professional types by the look of them. They're certainly investing a lot in finding one woman, Elizabeth remarked. It's not just about Madeline anymore, Mason explained. Word of Thomas Lawson's suspicious death has spread. Other homesteaders are asking questions, comparing notes about the bank's tactics. Harrington needs to contain this situation quickly before it threatens their entire operation. All the more reason our plan needs to work, Madeline said firmly. When do we proceed? Mason regarded her steadily. Tomorrow. I've arranged for Timothy to deliver a message to the Silver Ridge Hotel in the morning supposedly from you, requesting a meeting at the abandoned way station 3 miles east of town. Private, isolated, perfect for an exchange. And the protection you mentioned? Elizabeth asked, concern evident in her voice. 4 of our best men will be positioned around the station before Harrington and his people arrive. Jackson's friend from the Lazy S Ranch is lending us 3 of his most trusted hands as well. No one will reach Madeline without going through 7 armed men first. And you? Madeline asked, suddenly realizing he hadn't mentioned his own position in the plan. Mason's eyes met hers, dark and resolute. I'll be right beside you. They'll think I'm a hired gun you've paid for protection during the meeting. In reality, I'm your insurance and the witness who'll testify to whatever Harrington reveals. The plan was sound, yet Madeline couldn't suppress a shiver of apprehension. So much could go wrong. If Harrington suspected a trap, if his men overwhelmed Mason and the others, if the bank president refused to incriminate himself. You're having second thoughts, Mason observed, his voice low as the others began clearing the table. Wouldn't you? Madeline countered. We're gambling with lives. Yes, he agreed simply. But sometimes that's the only way to change things that need changing. He studied her face for a long moment. You can still back out. We could find another way. Madeline shook her head, squaring her shoulders. No, this ends tomorrow one way or another. My father deserves justice. Something flickered in Mason's eyes, approval, perhaps, or concern. He reached across the table, his hand briefly covering hers in a gesture that felt surprisingly intimate. Get some rest, then. Tomorrow will test us all. That night, sleep proved even more elusive than before. Madeline lay awake, rehearsing what she would say to Harrington, imagining every possible outcome of their dangerous gambit. When exhaustion finally claimed her in the early hours before dawn, her dreams were troubled visions of her father alternating with scenes of violence at the way station, Mason falling beneath a hail of bullets as she watched helplessly. She woke with the first light, heart pounding, the echo of gunshots from her dream still ringing in her ears. For a moment, she considered abandoning the plan, fleeing deeper into the territory where the bank might never find her. But that would mean surrendering her father's land, allowing his murderers to profit from their crime. She couldn't do it, wouldn't do it. Rising, Madeline washed and dressed with deliberate care, selecting the plainest of the clothes. Elizabeth had provided a simple dark skirt and jacket over a white blouse. She pinned her hair severely back from her face, emphasizing its pallor. The frightened, desperate young woman she needed to portray would have no thought for vanity. When she emerged from her room, she found the kitchen already bustling. The ranch hands who would accompany them ate quickly, their expressions somber. Elizabeth packed food for the journey, her movements efficient but tension evident in the tight line of her mouth. Mason stood by the door, checking and rechecking his pistols. He had exchanged his usual ranch clothes for darker attire that emphasized his dangerous appearance: black trousers, a dark blue shirt, and a black vest that did little to conceal the weapons he carried. When he looked up and saw Madeline, something in his expression shifted. "You look ready," he said simply. "I am," she replied, hoping her voice conveyed more confidence than she felt. They departed shortly after, a grim procession on horseback. Madeline rode beside Mason, with 4 Diamond J men following at a discreet distance. They would meet Jackson's friends' men at a predetermined location near the way station, establishing their positions before Harrington and his group arrived. The morning was cool, with a brisk wind sweeping down from the mountains. As they rode, Madeline found herself studying the landscape with new appreciation. The way sunlight caught the grass, turning it to gold, the distant silhouettes of deer at the edge of a copse. Even the dust their horses kicked up seemed somehow beautiful, motes dancing in the slanting light. If these were to be her last hours of freedom or even of life, she wanted to remember the world's beauty. Having second thoughts again, Mason asked quietly, noticing her distraction. "No," she answered truthfully, "just seeing things differently." "When every moment might be your last, you notice more," Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know that feeling well." Something in his tone made Madeline curious. "You've faced death before." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "More times than I care to remember." Makes a man appreciate the quiet moments between storms. "Is that why you came to the Diamond J? Looking for quiet?" A rueful smile touched his lips. "Something like that. I'd been riding with a rough crowd, men who solved problems with bullets first and questions later. After a while, that life starts eating at your soul." He glanced at her. "Jackson offered me a different path, a chance to use what I knew about violence to protect instead of harm." Madeline absorbed this, seeing Mason in a new light. "You were an outlaw," she concluded. "Not exactly," he corrected. "I worked for the territorial governor unofficially, dealt with problems that couldn't be handled through official channels. A gun for hire. A necessary evil in a land where law is still finding its footing," Mason replied, no defensiveness in his tone. "But yes, I've killed men. Some deserved it more than others." Madeline fell silent, processing this revelation. She should have been frightened by his admission, yet somehow it only deepened her trust in him. Mason James knew the darkness they were facing because he had walked in similar shadows himself. "Does that change how you see me?" he asked after a moment, his voice carefully neutral. Madeline considered the question seriously. "No," she finally answered. "It explains why you understand what we're facing better than most. Why you didn't hesitate to help a stranger in trouble." Relief flickered briefly across his features before his expression resumed its watchful intensity. "We're almost there," he said, nodding toward a structure appearing on the horizon. "The way station." The abandoned stage stop was a simple affair: a low stone building with a collapsed wooden roof, a crumbling corral, and a well that had likely run dry years ago. It stood alone in a shallow depression, visible from the road but offering little shelter or comfort to travelers. The stage line had established a new station closer to Silver Ridge years before, leaving this one to slowly return to the earth. As they approached, Madeline could see 3 riders already waiting near a stand of Cottonwoods Jackson's friends' men, in position as planned. Mason signaled to them, receiving an answering wave that confirmed all was well. "The Diamond J men will position themselves there, and there," Mason explained, pointing to strategic locations around the station. "You and I will wait inside. There's enough of the roof left to provide shade, but enough gaps that our men can see and hear what happens." They dismounted, leading their horses to a hitching post that still stood near the station's entrance. As Mason helped Madeline down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary, she felt a curious flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with fear. "Remember," he said softly, his face close to hers, "no matter what happens in there, you are not alone. I won't let them harm you." The intensity of his gaze made it difficult to breathe. "I know," Madeline managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Inside, the station was cool and dimly lit, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the collapsed roof. A few pieces of broken furniture remained: a bench, a desk missing 2 legs, a chair with half its back gone. Mason positioned the chair near the center of the room, where light from above illuminated it clearly. "You'll sit there," he instructed. "I'll stand behind you. It puts you in a position of apparent vulnerability while giving me the clearest line of fire if needed." Madeline nodded, taking her place as directed. The chair wobbled slightly beneath her, adding an unintentional authenticity to her role as the frightened, desperate woman. "They're coming," one of the Diamond J men called softly from his position near a window. Mason moved behind Madeline, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Remember what we practiced," he murmured. "Let Harrington do most of the talking. Appear frightened but resolute. The deed is your only leverage. Make him believe you understand its value." Madeline reached up, briefly squeezing his hand in acknowledgement. Then she arranged her features into a mask of fear and defiance, her eyes fixed on the doorway as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Moments later, shadows darkened the entrance. 3 men appeared, one in an expensive suit that marked him as a man of business, flanked by 2 rough-looking individuals whose hands never strayed far from their weapons. The suited man, Harrington, Madeline presumed, paused in the doorway, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimmer light before focusing on Madeline. "Miss Lawson," he greeted, his tone falsely cordial. "I'm pleased you agreed to this meeting. These unfortunate circumstances have caused quite enough trouble already." Madeline forced herself to meet his gaze, recognizing in his cold eyes the calculation of a predator. "Mr. Harrington," she acknowledged, her voice deliberately unsteady, "I came to negotiate, not to surrender." A thin smile stretched across Harrington's face as he stepped further into the room, his gaze flicking briefly to Mason before dismissing him as hired muscle. "A wise decision, though I must say your companion was not part of our arrangement." "Neither were your men," Madeline countered, nodding toward the gunmen. "I'm not foolish enough to meet you alone. Caution is indeed advisable in these troubled times," Harrington agreed smoothly. "Speaking of which, I understand you have something that belongs to my bank." "The deed to my father's land belongs to me," Madeline corrected, a genuine edge entering her voice. "As his only heir." Harrington waved a dismissive hand. "A technicality. Your father's outstanding debts to First National nullify any inheritance claims." "There were no debts," Madeline stated flatly. "The mortgage was paid in full 5 years ago. I have the documentation to prove it." A flash of something: anger, concern, crossed Harrington's face before his mask of civility returned. "My dear Miss Lawson, I fear your father misled you. Our records clearly show substantial obligations remaining." "Falsified records," Madeline challenged, her heart pounding. This was the moment they had planned for pushing Harrington to reveal his scheme. "Just as you falsified documents for the Johnson place and the Wilkerson homestead before that." Harrington's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Careful, Miss Lawson. Such accusations border on slander." "Not when they're true," Madeline pressed, feeling Mason's steadying presence behind her. "Not when I have proof of your arrangement with the railroad, how you force people from their land, then sell it at a profit to Western Union for their new spur line." A tense silence followed her words. Harrington exchanged glances with his men, a subtle communication passing between them. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its veneer of civility. "I see subtlety is wasted here. Very well. Let's speak plainly. You have documents that could cause my bank considerable inconvenience. I have men who are experienced in resolving inconveniences." He smiled coldly. "However, I'm a reasonable man. Surrender the deed and all other papers in your possession. Sign a statement confirming your father's debts, and you can leave Wyoming Territory with enough money to start fresh elsewhere." "And if I refuse?" Harrington shrugged elegantly. "Then I'm afraid these men will have to escort you back to Silver Ridge, where you'll face charges for your father's unfortunate death." "My father's murder, you mean," Madeline corrected, anger overcoming fear. "By men working for you." "A tragic misunderstanding," Harrington replied. "My representatives were merely defending themselves against an unstable man. At least, that's what the witnesses will testify." His gaze hardened. "Make no mistake, Miss Lawson. No court in this territory will take your word over mine. You will lose everything: your land, your freedom, possibly your life." "You seem very confident for a man committing fraud and murder." Mason spoke for the first time, his voice dangerously soft. Harrington regarded him with the contemptuous look of a man accustomed to dismissing those he considered beneath him. "And you would be someone who doesn't appreciate threats against women," Mason replied evenly. A thin smile stretched across Harrington's face. "Admirable. Foolish, but admirable." He turned his attention back to Madeline. "Your hired gun won't save you, Miss Lawson. I have 6 men outside, all very competent at their profession. The odds are not in your favor." It was Madeline's turn to smile, a small, satisfied expression that clearly unsettled Harrington. "You might want to reconsider those odds, Mr. Harrington." Before he could respond, a new voice called from the doorway. "That would be wise." Sheriff Caldwell stepped into the way station, followed by 2 deputies. Behind them, Madeline could see Jackson Diamond dismounting from his horse, alongside a distinguished-looking older man she didn't recognize. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrington demanded, his composure cracking for the first time. "The meaning, Mr. Harrington, is that you are under arrest," Caldwell stated firmly, "for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and suspicion of murder." Harrington's face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous." "Sheriff, I demand you arrest this woman for theft and obstruction of bank business." "I don't think so," the older man said as he entered, his bearing dignified despite the trail dust on his clothes. "Not after hearing your confession just now." "Judge Harris," Mason explained quietly to Madeline, who had risen from her chair in shock. "Jackson brought him from Cheyenne." "You have no authority here," Harrington blustered, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. "As territorial circuit judge, I have every authority," Harris corrected mildly, "especially when presented with compelling evidence of a criminal conspiracy." He held up Thomas Lawson's journal. "This document, combined with similar accounts from other homesteaders and your own words today, paint a disturbing picture, Mr. Harrington." One of Harrington's gunmen made a sudden move toward his weapon. Before he could draw, Mason's pistol was in his hand, the barrel pressed against the man's temple. "I wouldn't," Mason advised quietly. Sheriff Caldwell and his deputies quickly disarmed Harrington and his men, binding their hands with rope. The bank president's face was a mask of fury and disbelief as the reality of his situation dawned on him. "This isn't over," he hissed at Madeline as the deputies led him past. "Men like me have friends in high places. You'll regret this day." "No," Madeline replied, standing tall despite her trembling legs. "The only thing I regret is that my father didn't live to see justice done." As Harrington and his men were led away, Madeline felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The tension of the confrontation, the sudden reversal of fortune, the realization that her father's killers would face justice, it was overwhelming. She might have fallen if Mason hadn't stepped forward, his arm steady around her waist. "Easy," he murmured. "It's over now." But it wasn't over. Not entirely. There would be trials, testimony, legal battles over the land. The railroad wouldn't abandon its plans easily, and Harrington's friends in high places might yet cause problems. Yet for the first time since her father's death, Madeline felt something like hope. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at Mason. His eyes, warm and steady on hers, held a promise she hadn't expected. "That," he said softly, "is entirely up to you." The weeks following Harrington's arrest passed in a whirlwind of legal proceedings and revelations. Judge Harris ordered an immediate investigation into First National Bank's dealings, uncovering a pattern of fraud that stretched back years and implicated several prominent businessmen in Cheyenne. The territorial governor, eager to distance himself from the scandal, authorized special prosecutors to pursue the case with unprecedented vigor. Throughout it all, Madeline remained at the Diamond J, protected from the occasional threats that still came from Harrington's allies. Her testimony was crucial to the case, requiring several trips to Cheyenne under the protective escort of Mason and Sheriff Caldwell. Each journey strengthened her resolve and deepened her connection to the quiet, watchful man who had become her unexpected champion. "You're becoming quite the celebrity," Mason remarked one evening as they rode back to the ranch after a particularly grueling day of testimony. "That newspaper man couldn't write fast enough when you described how the bank falsified your father's debt records." Madeline smiled wryly. "Hardly a celebrity. More like a curiosity, the farmer's daughter who helped bring down a bank president." "You underestimate yourself," Mason replied, his tone serious despite his slight smile. "What you've done took extraordinary courage. Not many would have stood their ground against men like Harrington." "I had help," Madeline reminded him, glancing at his profile against the setting sun. "I wouldn't be alive without you, let alone testifying in court." Mason shook his head slightly. "You were fighting for your father's legacy before I ever found you on that road. All I did was offer a hand when you needed one." They rode in companionable silence for a time, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of birds settling for the night. Madeline found herself increasingly aware of Mason's presence beside her, the breadth of his shoulders, the strong lines of his face in profile, the way his hands held the reins with casual competence. It was a different kind of awareness than she'd felt in those early days of fear and uncertainty. This was something warmer, more insistent, both comforting and unsettling. "What will you do when this is all over?" Mason asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "When the trials are finished and the bank men sentenced?" The question caught Madeline off guard. She had been so focused on surviving each day, on pursuing justice for her father, that she'd given little thought to what might come after. "I don't know," she admitted. "Return to the homestead, I suppose. Try to make something of the land. Alone." The word hung between them, heavy with implications. Madeline kept her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "I've been alone before." "That doesn't mean you have to be alone again," Mason said quietly. Her heart quickened at his words, but uncertainty held her silent. What was he offering? Friendship? Protection? Something more? And was she ready to accept any of it? Before she could formulate a response, Mason continued, his tone deliberately casual. "Jackson mentioned he might need someone to manage the Diamond Jaytikes eastern acreage. It's good land, right alongside your father's property. Could be worked together with the right planning." Madeline glanced at him sharply. "Are you suggesting I sell my father's land to the Diamonds?" "No," Mason replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "I'm suggesting a partnership. Your land, my labor. We could build something worthwhile there." The implication behind his words made Madeline's breath catch. This wasn't just a business proposition. It was something far more personal. "Why would you want to tie yourself to a struggling homestead?" "To me." Mason reined his horse to a stop, prompting Madeline to do the same. In the golden light of sunset, his face was earnest, stripped of its usual guarded expression. "Because in all my years of wandering, I've never met anyone like you, Madeline Lawson. Because every day since I found you on that road, I've woken up thinking about how to keep you safe, how to make you smile. Because the thought of you returning to that homestead alone keeps me awake at night." Madeline stared at him, her heart pounding in her ears. No one had ever spoken to her this way, with such direct honesty, such open vulnerability. It both thrilled and terrified her. "Mason, she began, then faltered, uncertain how to express the tumult of emotions his words had unleashed. "I don't know what to say." A rueful smile touched his lips. "You don't have to say anything now. Just think about it, about the possibility." He urged his horse forward again, and Madeline followed, her mind racing with new possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. A life not defined by obligation and survival alone. A future shared with someone who saw her value, who chose to stand beside her by choice rather than circumstance. It was too much to process on a dusty trail at sunset. Too overwhelming after weeks of stress and uncertainty. Yet as they crested the final rise and the lights of the Diamond J appeared in the valley below, Madeline felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, a warmth that might, with care and courage, grow into something she had long believed herself incapable of receiving. Hope. The next morning, Madeline woke early, her mind still turning over Mason's words from the previous evening. A partnership. A shared future. The implications both exhilarated and frightened her. After years of believing herself destined for solitude, the possibility of another path seemed almost too fragile to contemplate. She dressed quickly and slipped outside, hoping fresh air might clear her thoughts. The ranch was already stirring, ranch hands heading toward the barn, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney, horses nickering in the corral. It had become familiar in the weeks she'd spent here, almost like a home. "You're up with the chickens," Elizabeth observed, finding Madeline by the garden fence. The older woman carried a basket for gathering vegetables, her practical skirts already dusted with soil. "Couldn't sleep," Madeline shook her head. "Too much thinking." "About the trials?" Elizabeth asked, though her knowing glance suggested she suspected otherwise. "Partly," Madeline hedged, following Elizabeth into the garden. "And other things." Elizabeth handed her a smaller basket. "Help me with these beans while you sort through those other things." Work makes thinking clearer. They worked in companionable silence for a time, moving between rows of vegetables in the cool morning air. Elizabeth didn't press for conversation, allowing Madeline the space to organize her thoughts. It was one of the things Madeline had come to appreciate most about the older woman, her ability to offer support without intrusion. Mason suggested a partnership, Madeline finally said, the words emerging more abruptly than she'd intended. Working my father's land together. Elizabeth's hands paused briefly before resuming their efficient harvesting. I see, and what did you tell him? Nothing yet. I'm not sure what to think. Elizabeth straightened, regarding Madeline with shrewd eyes. Are we talking about a business arrangement or something more? Heat rushed to Madeline's cheeks. I think. Both. Maybe. He wasn't entirely clear. A smile tugged at Elizabeth's mouth. Mason James isn't a man who does things halfway. If he's offering a partnership, I suspect he's considering all aspects of what that might entail. She studied Madeline's flustered expression. The question is, are you? I don't know, Madeline admitted, setting down her basket to pluck anxiously at her skirt. After my father died, I thought I'd be alone forever. I'd accepted that. And now someone is offering you a different future, Elizabeth finished gently. And you're afraid to reach for it. Madeline nodded, tears suddenly threatening. What if I can't be what he needs? What if I'm too broken, too damaged by everything that's happened? Elizabeth took Madeline's hands in her soil-stained ones. Listen to me, child. We're all broken in some way. Every last one of us. It's not about being perfect for someone else, it's about finding the person whose broken pieces fit with yours, creating something stronger together than either could be alone. Is that how it was with you and Jackson? Madeline asked softly. A wistful smile crossed Elizabeth's face. Oh yes. I had a past that made most men run for the hills. Jackson had ghosts of his own from the war. Neither of us was whole but together. She squeezed Madeline's hands. Together, we built something beautiful. Madeline absorbed this, finding unexpected comfort in Elizabeth's words. Perhaps being worthy of love wasn't about being flawless or undamaged. Perhaps it was simpler and more profound than that. I'm scared, she confessed. Not just of being hurt, but of hurting him. Mason deserves someone who can love him completely without reservation. I'm not sure I know how. None of us do at first, Elizabeth replied. Love isn't something you know instinctively. It's something you learn day by day, choice by choice. Her expression grew serious. But I will tell you this. Mason James has been part of our family for 5 years, and in all that time, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Before Madeline could respond, the garden gate creaked open. Jackson Diamond entered, his expression grave. Elizabeth, Madeline. I've just had word from town. There's been a development in the case. Madeline tensed immediately. What's happened? Harrington's been released on bail, Jackson said grimly. His connections in Cheyenne pulled some strings. Judge Harris is furious, but there was nothing he could do. Released, Madeline echoed, cold fear washing over her. But he threatened me. He killed my father. The judge has ordered protection for you, Jackson assured her. Sheriff Caldwell is sending a deputy to stay at the ranch, and the trial date has been moved up. But until then, he hesitated. Until then, I'm still in danger, Madeline finished flatly. Elizabeth's hand tightened around hers. You're safe here. We won't let anything happen to you. Madeline appreciated their concern, but a new resolve was forming within her. She was tired of living in fear, tired of allowing Harrington and men like him to control her fate. Where's Mason? She asked suddenly. Checking fence lines on the north pasture, Jackson answered, surprised by the abrupt question. He should be back by midday. Why? I need to speak with him, Madeline said, a plan taking shape in her mind. About the future. Jackson and Elizabeth exchanged glances, sensing the determination in her voice. Whatever you're thinking, be careful, Elizabeth cautioned. Harrington is dangerous, especially now that he's cornered. I know, Madeline acknowledged, but I'm done hiding, done waiting for others to decide my fate. She looked between the two people who had become like family to her. It's time I took back what's mine, my land, my future, my right to choose who and what I want to be. As she spoke the words, Madeline felt a certainty she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. Whatever came next, whether facing Harrington in court or facing her own fears about love and worthiness, she would meet it head-on, with courage and conviction. Because for the first time in her life, she had something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. She had the possibility of happiness. When Mason returned from the north pasture shortly after noon, dust-covered and weary, Madeline was waiting. She had spent the morning preparing herself not just mentally for the conversation ahead, but practically for what might follow. Her father's journal and deed were secured in a leather pouch. A small bag contained the few personal items she'd accumulated during her stay at the Diamond J. And in her pocket, a folded paper held the outline of a proposition she hoped Mason would consider. She found him in the barn, unsaddling his horse, his movements efficient despite his obvious fatigue. For a moment, she simply watched him, appreciating the strength in his shoulders, the gentle way he handled his mount, the quiet words he murmured to the animal as he worked. This was a man comfortable with himself, with his place in the world, a man who had offered her a place beside him. "You're staring," Mason observed without turning, a smile in his voice. "You knew I was here?" Madeline asked, stepping further into the barn. "I always know when you're near," he replied simply, finally turning to face her. His expression grew serious as he noted her travel-ready appearance. "You've heard about Harrington," Madeline nodded. "Jackson told us this morning, and now you're leaving." It wasn't a question, but disappointment shadowed his eyes. "Yes," Madeline confirmed, "but not alone." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Not if you meant what you said yesterday." Mason went very still, his dark eyes intent on her face. "I meant every word." "Then I have a proposition for you," Madeline said, withdrawing the folded paper from her pocket. Her hand trembled slightly as she offered it to him. "A partnership, as you suggested, but with some conditions of my own." Mason accepted the paper, unfolding it carefully. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to surprise, then to something deeper, more profound. When he looked up, there was a brightness in his eyes that caught at Madeline's heart. "You want to rebuild the homestead," he said. "Together." "Yes," Madeline confirmed. "Not just as a farm, but as a home, our home." She stepped closer, emboldened by the warmth in his gaze. "Harrington's release changes things. I can't keep hiding here, living in fear. I need to reclaim my father's land, our land, if you're willing. Make it something he would be proud of." "It's dangerous," Mason cautioned, though she could see he was already considering the possibility. "Harrington knows where the homestead is. It would be the first place he'd look for you." "Exactly," Madeline agreed. "Which is why we turn that to our advantage, set our own trap on our own terms." Understanding dawned in Mason's eyes. "You want to draw him out, force his hand before the trial. If he comes after me, tries to silence me again, he violates his bail conditions. Goes straight back to jail with new charges added." Madeline's voice was steady, her plan laid out with careful thought. "Judge Harris suggested it himself, through Jackson. Said it might be the only way to ensure Harrington faces justice, given his connections." Mason studied her for a long moment. "This isn't just about justice anymore, is it? This is about claiming your future, our future." Madeline nodded, her throat suddenly tight with emotion. "I've spent my whole life believing I was meant to be alone, that I didn't deserve anything more, that I was unlovable." The word emerged as barely a whisper. My father needed me, but he never saw me. Not really. I was just useful, necessary. She took another step toward Mason, close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. But you see me. From that first night on the road, you've seen me. Not as someone broken or useful, but as someone worth protecting, worth standing beside. Mason's hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as a summer breeze. Worth loving, he corrected softly, because you are, Madeline, more than you know. The words unlocked something in Madeline's chest, a tight, protected place that had held her heart captive for years. Tears spilled over, tracking silently down her cheeks as she leaned into his touch. I'm afraid, she admitted. Not of Harrington or what might happen at the homestead. I'm afraid of this, of feeling so much, of wanting so much. I know, Mason murmured, his thumb brushing away her tears. Believe me, I understand fear, but some things are worth being afraid for. His gaze held hers, steady and certain. You are worth being afraid for, Madeline Lawson, worth fighting for, worth building a life with. Then, with infinite gentleness, he lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, tender, a promise rather than a demand. But it sealed something between them, a covenant more binding than any legal partnership, more profound than any spoken vow. When they parted, Madeline felt transformed, still herself, but somehow more. As though parts of her that had been dormant were finally awakening, stretching toward the light of possibility that Mason offered. So, she said, her voice stronger now, will you come with me? Help me reclaim what's mine and build something new. Mason's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Try and stop me. They left for the Lawson homestead the following morning, their departure a somber affair despite the hope that underlay their journey. Jackson insisted on sending 2 of his most trusted hands with them, not just for protection, but to help with the immediate work of securing the property. Elizabeth packed enough provisions to last a week, along with seeds for replanting the garden and curtain material for the cabin windows. A home needs curtains, she declared firmly, pressing the fabric into Madeline's hands. And a woman needs her privacy, especially with a man around. The implication made Madeline blush, though she and Mason had already discussed practical arrangements. He would sleep in the barn until proper preparations could be made for a wedding. Propriety would be maintained, even in their isolated situation. Not just for appearance's sake, but because both felt the significance of what they were building deserved the sanctity of formal commitment. Sheriff Caldwell met them at the edge of Diamond J property, accompanied by a deputy who would remain in the area, keeping watch from a distance. Harrington's been seen meeting with known gunmen in Cheyenne, the sheriff informed them grimly. He's planning something, no doubt about it. You sure you want to go through with this? More sure than I've been about anything, Madeline replied, her gaze briefly meeting Mason's. We're done running. The sheriff nodded, respect evident in his weathered face. Judge Harris wired that he's issued orders for Harrington to stay at least 50 miles from your property as a condition of his bail. The moment he violates that order, I can arrest him, no questions asked. He'll violate it, Mason predicted darkly. Men like Harrington believe themselves above the law. He won't be able to resist trying to eliminate the threat Madeline poses before the trial. Then we'll be ready, Caldwell assured them. My deputy will check in twice daily. Any sign of trouble, fire 3 shots in the air. We'll come running. The journey to the Lawson homestead took most of the day, following roads that curved around foothills and through shallow valleys. As they traveled, Madeline found herself seeing the landscape with new eyes, not as the backdrop to her father's failure and death, but as the setting for a new beginning. The late summer light gilded the prairie grasses, turning them to waves of gold that rippled in the breeze. In the distance, The mountains stood blue and eternal, their peaks already dusted with the first hint of winter snow. "It's beautiful country," Mason observed, following her gaze. "Rich, too, with the right management. Your father picked well when he settled here." "He did," Madeline agreed, a bittersweet ache in her chest at the memory of her father in better days, strong, hopeful, showing her the boundaries of their new claim with pride in his voice. "He used to say we were building something that would last generations. I think he'd be glad to know it might still happen, even if not the way he imagined." As they crested the final rise, the Lawson homestead came into view in the valley below. The cabin stood as Madeline had left it, a simple structure of logs and stone, its small windows dark, the door still ajar from her hasty flight weeks before. Nearby, the barn leaned slightly to one side, in need of repair but still standing. The fields beyond lay fallow, the drought-withered remnants of crops long since blown away by prairie winds. Yet despite its abandoned appearance, there was something hopeful about the homestead's silhouette against the late afternoon sky. A skeleton waiting to be fleshed out with life and purpose once more. "Home," Madeline murmured, emotions too complex to name tightening her throat. Mason reached across the space between their horses, his hand finding hers. "Home," he agreed, "or it will be." The next hours passed in a flurry of activity as they secured the property. The Diamond J hands helped Mason repair the broken door and check the barn for structural weaknesses. Madeline, meanwhile, set about cleaning the cabin, sweeping away months of dust and disuse. She deliberately avoided looking at the spot near the hearth where she had found her father's body, focusing instead on making the single room habitable again. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, and a simple meal prepared from Elizabeth's provisions. The Diamond J hands established a camp near the barn, while Sheriff Caldwell's deputy positioned himself on a rise overlooking the approach to the homestead. Inside the cabin, Madeline hung Elizabeth's curtains at the windows, transforming the space with their cheerful pattern. When Mason entered, bringing an armload of firewood, he paused in the doorway, struck by the change. "You've worked miracles," he said, taking in the swept floor, the freshly made bed in the corner, the table set with the few dishes Madeline had salvaged. "Hardly miracles," Madeline demurred, though pleasure at his approval warmed her. "Just a woman's touch." "Your touch," Mason clarified, setting the wood beside the hearth. "That makes all the difference." They shared a simple supper, discussing plans for the coming days, which fields to prepare first, how to reinforce the barn, whether to dig a new well closer to the house. Practical matters, yet underlying each decision was the shared understanding that they were building not just a farm but a life together. As night deepened, the time came for Mason to retire to the barn. He rose reluctantly, his gaze lingering on Madeline. "I'll be close," he assured her. "If there's any trouble, I know," she interrupted softly. "But there won't be, not tonight. Harrington is many things, but he's not foolish enough to move against us so soon." Mason nodded, though concern still shadowed his eyes. "Even so, keep your father's rifle close." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. For a moment, Madeline thought he might say more, perhaps speak the words that hovered between them, acknowledged but not yet fully expressed. Instead, he simply nodded once more and slipped out into the night, leaving Madeline alone with her thoughts. She secured the door behind him, then moved about the cabin, extinguishing lanterns until only the firelight illuminated the space. Sitting in her father's old rocking chair, Madeline gazed into the flames, allowing memories to wash over her childhood evenings in this very spot, her father's voice spinning tales of the old country, adolescent dreams of a different life, perhaps in a city far from the isolation of the homestead. more recent recollections of nursing her father through his final illness, watching helplessly as he faded day by day. Yet alongside these memories, new images formed. Mason working beside her to rebuild what neglect and malice had damaged, their children playing in the yard on summer evenings, a lifetime of seasons passing in this place that would become truly home in a way it had never quite been before. "I'm coming back, Father," she whispered to the quiet room, "but on my terms this time, with someone who sees me as more than just your daughter or a pair of hands to work the land." The fire crackled in response, sparks dancing up the chimney like ephemeral spirits. Madeline imagined her father's approval in that gentle sound, his blessing on the new life she was creating from the ashes of the old. The following days established a rhythm that felt both novel and somehow familiar. Madeline and Mason worked from dawn to dusk, repairing, cleaning, preparing. The Diamond J hands proved invaluable, their strength and skills accelerating work that would have taken weeks alone. Fields were cleared for planting, the barn roof mended, a garden plot tilled and fenced against rabbits and deer. Throughout it all, Madeline found herself watching Mason, the competent way he handled tools, the ease with which he directed the other men, the quiet authority he possessed without ever raising his voice. He was a natural leader, respected by those who worked alongside him. And increasingly, she noticed, his gaze would find hers across the yard or fields, a silent communication passing between them that needed no words. Each night, Mason retired to the barn, and each morning he appeared at the cabin door as dawn broke, ready for another day of shared labor. Their conversation flowed easily around practical matters, occasionally touching on deeper subjects: Mason's childhood in Missouri, Madeline's memories of her mother, their shared love of books and music. Layer by layer, they built understanding alongside the physical structures taking shape around them. On the fourth day, a wagon arrived from town, bearing lumber and supplies Mason had ordered. Among them was a packet from Judge Harris, legal documents confirming Madeline's ownership of the property and formal notification that the trial date had been set for the following month. "It's really happening," Madeline said that evening as they sat on the cabin's newly repaired porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Harrington will face justice for what he did." Mason nodded, though his expression remained vigilant. "Assuming he appears for trial, I'm still concerned that he might try something desperate before then." "Let him try," Madeline replied with unexpected fierceness. "I'm done being afraid of men like him." Mason's smile held equal parts pride and concern. "Courage suits you, Madeline Lawson. But don't underestimate Harrington's desperation. Men with everything to lose are the most dangerous kind." "I know," she acknowledged, her hand finding his where it rested on the porch step between them. "But I'm not alone anymore. That makes all the difference." His fingers intertwined with hers, strong and sure. "No, you're not alone, and you never will be again if I have any say in the matter." The simple statement, delivered without flourish or elaboration, touched Madeline more deeply than any flowery declaration could have. Mason James was not a man of many words, but those he chose carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I've been thinking," she said after a moment, her heart quickening with nervousness despite the certainty of her decision. "About us, about the future." Mason turned to face her more fully, his expression attentive. "What about it?" Madeline took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I don't want to wait until after the trial to be married. I want to do it now, before Harrington can interfere further in our lives." Surprise and pleasure chased across Mason's features. "Are you sure? I thought you wanted time to rebuild, to establish ourselves here first." "I did," Madeline admitted, But these past days have shown me something important. The building, the establishing, it's already happening. Every decision we make together, every task we complete side by side, is laying the foundation for our future. Why wait to formalize what we already know to be true? Mason studied her face in the fading light, as though searching for any hint of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, his expression softened into a smile that transformed his features, erasing the vigilance that so often marked his countenance. "Madeline Lawson," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "are you asking me to marry you?" A laugh escaped her light-free, surprising herself with its ease. "I believe I am, Mason James, though if you'd prefer to do the asking, I wouldn't object." In response, Mason shifted from the porch step to one knee before her, still holding her hand in his. The position was traditional, formal, yet his eyes held a warmth that made the gesture deeply personal. "I've been carrying these words in my heart since the day you agreed to come back here with me," he said quietly, "waiting for the right moment to speak them. It seems you've decided that moment is now." His free hand reached into his vest pocket, withdrawing something small that caught the last rays of sunlight. A ring, simple, elegant, a band of gold with a single small diamond at its center. "This was my mother's," Mason explained, holding it between them. "The only thing of hers I managed to keep through all my wandering years. I've been carrying it since we left the Diamond J, hoping for the courage to offer it to you." Madeline's breath caught in her throat, tears blurring her vision. "Mason." "Madeline Lawson," he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I came to Wyoming looking for peace, for a place to belong after years of restlessness. I found it at the Diamond J, but it wasn't complete. Something was still missing." His thumb brushed gently over her knuckles. "Then I found you on that road, fierce and frightened and more alive than anyone I'd ever met, and I knew my heart had found its home." He held the ring higher, a promise made tangible. "I love you, Madeline. Your strength, your determination, your capacity for hope even in the darkest moments. I want to build a life with you here, not just a farm or a ranch, but a true home. Will you marry me? Not someday in the future, but now, while we're still finding our way." Tears spilled freely down Madeline's cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, Mason James. I will marry you today, tomorrow, whenever we can find someone to perform the ceremony." Mason slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as though it had been made for her hand alone. Then he rose, drawing her to her feet and into his embrace. His kiss was different this time, not the gentle promise of their first embrace, but a deeper claiming, a sealing of vows already made in their hearts. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, the first stars had appeared in the darkening sky. "Tomorrow," Mason said decisively. "We'll ride into Silver Ridge tomorrow and find the preacher. No more waiting." Madeline nodded, her heart too full for words. Tomorrow she would become Mason's wife. Tomorrow they would begin their life together officially, before God and witnesses. The thought filled her with a joy so profound, it was almost frightening in its intensity. Yet as they stood there in the gathering dusk, arms still encircling each other, a shadow crossed Madeline's happiness. Somewhere out there, Richard Harrington was plotting his revenge. Tomorrow might bring not just marriage vows, but danger. The man who had killed her father would not rest until he had silenced her as well. As if sensing her thoughts, Mason's arms tightened around her. "Don't worry about Harrington," he murmured against her hair. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together. I won't let him harm you." Madeline nodded against his chest, drawing strength from his certainty. Whatever tomorrow brought, joy or peril, celebration or confrontation, they would meet it as one. and that knowledge was enough to banish fear, at least for this precious moment under the emerging stars. The ride to Silver Ridge the next morning was tense with both anticipation and vigilance. Mason insisted they take the Diamond J hands with them as escort, their presence a visible deterrent to any trouble Harrington might have planned. Sheriff Caldwell's deputy rode ahead, scouting the trail for signs of ambush or surveillance. Despite these precautions, Madeline's heart was light as they approached the small town. She wore her best dress, a deep blue calico Elizabeth had helped her mend and freshen, and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered from a meadow near the homestead. Mason, too, had made an effort with his appearance, wearing a clean white shirt and black vest, his usually unruly hair slicked back neatly. Silver Ridge presented a different aspect in daylight than it had on the night Madeline first arrived, desperate and hunted. The main street bustled with activity wagons delivering goods to the general store, cowboys lounging outside the saloon, women shopping or visiting between errands. It was a typical frontier town, neither prosperous nor destitute, its wooden buildings weathered by sun and wind. As their small party rode down the street, heads turned to watch their progress. Madeline felt the weight of curious stares, heard the murmurs that followed their passing. She was known here now, the homesteader's daughter who had defied the bank, whose testimony threatened to bring down one of the territory's most powerful men. Some gazes held sympathy or support, others, suspicion or hostility. "Ignore them," Mason advised quietly as they dismounted in front of a small whitewashed church at the edge of town. "Their opinions don't matter." The church was simple but well-maintained, its steeple rising hopefully toward the cloudless sky. As Mason tied their horses to the hitching post, the front door opened to reveal a thin, elderly man in clerical garb. "Reverend Porter," Mason greeted him. "Thank you for agreeing to see us on such short notice." "Mr. James," the preacher replied, his gaze moving curiously to Madeline. "And this must be Miss Lawson. I've heard much about you, my dear." "I hope at least some of it was good," Madeline replied with a smile, instantly warming to the kindly old man. "Indeed it was," Porter assured her. "Your stand against injustice has inspired many in these parts." "Now, I understand you've come seeking the Lord's blessing on a union." "We have," Mason confirmed, his hand finding Madeline's. "If you're willing to perform the ceremony today." The Reverend's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. Such haste is unusual, though not unheard of in these parts. "May I ask the reason for your urgency?" Madeline exchanged glances with Mason before responding. "Life is uncertain, Reverend, especially now with the trial approaching. We don't want to delay our happiness because of one man's malice." Understanding dawned in the old man's eyes. "Ah. Mr. Harrington's threats continue, I take it." "They do," Mason confirmed grimly. "Which is why we'd prefer to complete the ceremony quickly and return to the homestead before word spreads too far." Reverend Porter nodded thoughtfully. "Very well. I can perform the service immediately, if that's your wish, though it seems a shame not to have more witnesses to such a joyous occasion." "We have witnesses," Madeline assured him, gesturing to the Diamond J hands who stood respectfully nearby. "Good men who have helped us rebuild what was damaged. They're all the guests we need." The ceremony itself was brief but deeply moving. Standing before the simple altar, hands joined, Madeline and Mason exchanged vows that held the weight of promise and certainty. Madeline's voice trembled slightly as she pledged herself to Mason, but her eyes never left his, drawing strength from the unwavering devotion she saw reflected there. "With this ring, I thee wed," Mason said clearly, sliding a simple gold band onto her finger to join his mother's engagement ring. With my body I thee worship. With all my worldly goods I thee endow. The traditional words, spoken in his deep, steady voice, washed over Madeline like a benediction. This man, this strong, honorable man, was giving himself to her completely, offering everything he was and had without reservation or condition. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Porter declared, beaming at the couple before him. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Mason leaned down to seal their vows with a kiss, Madeline felt a profound sense of rightness settle in her soul. Whatever happened next, whether they had decades together or only days, they belonged to each other now, before God and man. No one, not even Richard Harrington, could take that away. The moment was interrupted by the church door bursting open. Sheriff Caldwell stood there, his expression urgent. "Mason," he called, "we've got trouble. Harrington's men have been spotted on the edge of town, at least 6 of them heavily armed." Mason's arm tightened protectively around Madeline's waist. "Where's Harrington himself?" "Not with them, as far as we can tell," Caldwell replied. "But they're definitely looking for something or someone." "Or creating a diversion," Mason said grimly. "We need to get back to the homestead. Now." Understanding flashed between them. If Harrington wasn't with his men in town, he might be using them as a distraction while he moved against the Lawson property, directly destroying evidence, perhaps, or setting an ambush for their return. "Go," Reverend Porter urged, understanding the danger. "I'll pray for your safety." They left the church hurriedly, Mason helping Madeline mount her horse before swinging up onto his own. The Diamond J hands formed a protective circle around the newlyweds as they rode swiftly through town, drawing more stares and whispers as they passed. At the edge of Silver Ridge, Sheriff Caldwell reined in beside them. "I'll deal with Harrington's men here. You get back to your place. My deputy should still be in the area. He'll help if there's trouble." Mason nodded gratefully. "Be careful, Sheriff. These aren't ordinary troublemakers." "Neither am I," Caldwell replied with a grim smile. "Now go. And congratulations, both of you. When this is over, Elizabeth Diamond will never forgive me if we don't have a proper celebration at the ranch." With that, he turned his horse back toward town, leaving Mason and Madeline to continue their journey homeward. They rode hard, pushing their mounts as fast as was safe given the terrain. Madeline's wedding dress billowed around her legs, her carefully arranged hair coming loose in the wind of their passage. Yet despite the urgency of their flight, she couldn't help but feel a fierce joy. She was riding toward home with her husband at her side. Whatever awaited them there, they would face it together. The sun was high overhead when they crested the final rise overlooking the Lawson homestead. Madeline's breath caught at the sight that greeted them. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney, smoke that shouldn't have been there, since they had banked the fire before leaving that morning. And on the porch, visible even from this distance, sat a familiar figure in an expensive suit, a rifle resting casually across his knees. Richard Harrington had come calling. "Stay here," Mason ordered immediately, signaling the Diamond J hands to spread out along the ridge. "All of you, I'll approach alone." "No," Madeline protested, her hand catching his arm. "He's here for me. I won't let you face him alone." Mason's expression was torn between admiration and fear for her safety. "Madeline, he's armed and desperate. This isn't the courthouse. He's not here to negotiate." "I know exactly why he's here," Madeline replied steadily. "To silence me before I can testify, but he can't silence both of us. And he can't outshoot all of us." She glanced at the Diamond J hands who had already readied their rifles, watching the cabin with narrowed eyes. "We approach together, husband and wife. Let him see that I'm not alone anymore, that I never will be again." For a moment, Mason looked as though he might continue to argue, Then, with a brief nod, he relented. "Together, then. But stay slightly behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments." Madeline agreed, though privately she had no intention of fleeing if Mason were in danger. They had made vows just hours before, vows that bound them in all circumstances, including peril. They descended the slope slowly, making no attempt to conceal their approach. Harrington remained seated on the porch, watching their advance with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself in control of the situation. Only when they were within 50 yards did he stand, the rifle held loosely in his hands. "Miss Lawson," he called, deliberately using her maiden name despite the Diamond J hands within earshot who had witnessed her marriage. "How kind of you to return. I was beginning to think I'd have to burn your charming home to flush you out." "That's Mrs. James now," Madeline corrected, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "And you're trespassing on private property, Mr. Harrington, property that legally belongs to me." Harrington's smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "For the moment, perhaps. But dead women can't own property, my dear. Their estates typically revert to their creditors." "Is that a threat?" Mason asked, his tone deceptively calm, though Madeline could feel the tension radiating from him. "Merely an observation of legal fact," Harrington replied smoothly. "Accidents happen so frequently in these isolated places. A fire, a fall, a stray bullet from rustlers or Indians." He shrugged elegantly. "The territorial authorities rarely investigate too deeply." They had reached the edge of the yard now, close enough that Madeline could see the sweat beading on Harrington's forehead despite his attempt at composure. The bank president was afraid, she realized. For all his bluster and threats, he was a man unaccustomed to direct confrontation, to physical danger. "You're violating the conditions of your bail," Mason pointed out, stopping 20 paces from the porch. "The judge ordered you to stay at least 50 miles from this property." "Did he?" Harrington feigned surprise. "I must have misunderstood. In any case, I'm merely here to discuss business with Pardon me, Mrs. James. Your testimony has created quite a stir in financial circles. My associates believe a settlement might be in everyone's best interest." "The only settlement I'm interested in is seeing you hang for my father's murder," Madeline replied evenly. Harrington's facade of civility slipped, his expression hardening. "Your father was a stubborn old fool who should have taken the money when it was offered. His death was regrettable but necessary, as yours will be if you continue on this ill-advised course." "You're admitting to murder," Mason observed, his hand moving imperceptibly closer to his holstered pistol. "In front of witnesses." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Harrington's face as he registered the Diamond J hands positioned on the ridge, rifles trained on the scene below. He had clearly expected to find Madeline alone, or at most accompanied by Mason. The presence of multiple armed men changed the equation significantly. "Witnesses can meet with accidents too," Harrington said, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. "As can judges and sheriffs. My associates have long reaches and deep pockets." "Not deep enough to save you from the gallows," came a new voice from behind the cabin. Sheriff Caldwell stepped into view, his deputy beside him. Both had pistols drawn and aimed squarely at Harrington. "Richard Harrington, you're under arrest for violating the conditions of your bail, threatening witnesses, and conspiracy to commit murder." Harrington's face contorted with rage and desperation. In a movement born of panic rather than calculation, he raised his rifle, swinging it toward Madeline. "If I'm going to hang anyway," he began. The report of Mason's pistol cut him off mid-sentence. Harrington staggered backward, the rifle clattering to the porch as his hands clutched at his shoulder where blood blossomed against the expensive fabric of his suit. "The next one goes through your heart," Mason stated flatly, his pistol still trained on the bank president. "Drop to your knees. Now." Harrington sank down, his face gray with shock and pain. Sheriff Caldwell moved forward quickly, securing the wounded man's hands behind his back despite his whimpered protests. "Nice shot," Caldwell commented to Mason. "Most men would have aimed for the chest." "I didn't want to deprive the hangman," Mason replied, his voice hard. Only when he turned to Madeline did his expression soften. "Are you all right?" Madeline nodded, surprised to find her hands steady, her mind clear despite the violence she had just witnessed. "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." She looked at Harrington, kneeling in the dirt, all his power and arrogance stripped away. "It's over. Really over." "It is," Mason agreed, holstering his pistol and wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "He'll stand trial for everything now: your father's murder, the fraud, and attempted murder of a witness. There won't be any bail this time." Sheriff Caldwell hauled Harrington to his feet, ignoring his continued complaints about his wound. "I'd better get him to a doctor, then to a cell. Judge Harris will want to hear about this immediately." He tipped his hat to Madeline. "Mrs. James, sorry about the interruption to your wedding day." Madeline found herself smiling despite the circumstances. "Actually, Sheriff, I think it was the perfect conclusion. The past is settled. Now we can focus on the future." As Caldwell led Harrington away, the Diamond J hands descended from the ridge, surrounding the newlyweds with congratulations and relieved laughter. The tension of the confrontation dissolved into celebration as they all realized the danger had truly passed. Standing on the land that had been her father's and was now hers and Mason's, Madeline felt a profound sense of completion. The circle had closed. Justice would be done for her father. The land would remain in the family, as he had wished. And she had found something she had never expected or believed possible: a love that saw her completely, that valued her for herself rather than her usefulness. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked softly as the others moved toward the barn, talking of impromptu wedding celebrations, and breaking out the whiskey Jackson Diamond had sent along for just such an occasion. Madeline looked up at her husband, the words still new and wonderful in her mind, and smiled. "I'm thinking that this is just the beginning, that we have a lifetime ahead to build something beautiful here." Mason's eyes, warm and certain on hers, held promises that made her heart quicken. "A lifetime," he agreed. "And I intend to make the most of every day of it, Mrs. James." As he bent to kiss her, there in the yard of the home they would build together, Madeline knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Not because fate or obligation had placed her there, but because love freely given and joyfully received had created a place where her heart could finally, truly live. 3 years later, the sound of childish laughter echoed across the yard of the James homestead as Madeline hung laundry on the line, smiling at the sight of her 2-year-old son toddling after a butterfly. Thomas Mason James had his father's dark hair and steady gaze, but his quick smile and curious nature were pure Lawson, according to Mason. "Don't go too far, Thomas," she called, watching as the boy veered dangerously close to the garden fence. At her voice he turned, beaming a gap-toothed smile that never failed to melt her heart. "Butterfly, Mama," he exclaimed, pointing excitedly at his elusive quarry. "I see it, sweetheart. Just stay where Mama can see you." The homestead had transformed in the 3 years since their wedding day. The cabin had been expanded to include 2 additional rooms, a proper bedroom for them, and a smaller one for Thomas. A wide, covered porch wrapped around 3 sides, providing shade in summer and shelter in the snowy winter months. The barn had been rebuilt entirely, now housing not just their horses but a small dairy herd that provided milk for both their use and for sale in Silver Ridge. Fields that had once lain fallow now produced abundant wheat, corn, and vegetables. Thanks to the irrigation system Mason had designed using water from the creek that crossed their property. A young orchard of apple and cherry trees promised future harvests, their slender trunks supported by stakes against the prairie winds. But the greatest transformation wasn't in the buildings or fields, it was in Madeline herself. The frightened, grief-stricken young woman who had fled her father's killers was now a confident wife and mother, secure in her place and purpose. The love she had once believed herself incapable of receiving or giving now flowed freely, enriching every aspect of her life. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Mason appeared over the rise, returning from his morning ride checking fence lines. Even after 3 years of marriage, the sight of him still quickened her pulse, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the sky, the easy grace with which he handled his horse, the smile that appeared on his face when he spotted her and Thomas in the yard. "Papa!" Thomas squealed, abandoning his butterfly chase to toddle toward his father as fast as his little legs would carry him. Mason swung down from his horse in one fluid motion, kneeling to catch his son in a bear hug that produced delighted giggles. "There's my boy. Have you been helping your mama this morning?" "He's been chasing butterflies while I do the washing," Madeline corrected with a smile, moving to greet her husband. "But he did help feed the chickens earlier, threw the corn everywhere except in the coop, but his heart was in the right place." Mason laughed, settling Thomas on his hip as he leaned in to kiss Madeline. "Like father, like son. I never could hit a target on my first try either." "Liar," Madeline teased, recalling his perfect shot that had disabled Harrington 3 years before. "You never miss what you aim for." "True enough," Mason agreed, his free arm slipping around her waist to draw her closer. "I aimed for you, didn't I? And here we are." The simple statement, delivered with his characteristic understated certainty, warmed Madeline to her core. Here they were indeed a family, built from the ashes of tragedy and strengthened by every challenge they had faced together. "Letter came from Elizabeth," Mason said as they walked toward the house, Thomas still perched on his hip. "Jackson's finally agreed to reduce his responsibilities at the ranch. They're talking about visiting us next month, staying for a proper visit this time." "That's wonderful news," Madeline replied, genuinely pleased. The Diamonds had become true family to them, visiting whenever possible and taking a doting grandparental interest in Thomas. "We'll have to prepare the guest room." "Already planning the menu, aren't you?" Mason teased, knowing her tendency to fuss over visitors. "Maybe," Madeline admitted with a smile. "Elizabeth deserves to be spoiled a little after all she's done for us." They entered the cabin together, the familiar sense of home welcoming them, fresh bread cooling on the table, wildflowers in a jar by the window, the subtle fragrance of the beeswax Madeline used to polish the simple furniture Mason had crafted. It wasn't a grand house by any means, but it was theirs, filled with the evidence of their shared life. While Mason settled Thomas with some wooden blocks on a quilt near the hearth, Madeline retrieved a letter of her own from the small writing desk in the corner. "This came yesterday," she said, her tone more serious. "From Judge Harris." Mason looked up, instantly alert to the change in her voice. "What does he say?" "Harrington died in prison last week. Consumption, apparently. He never did serve his full sentence." A complex mixture of emotions crossed Mason's face, not satisfaction or triumph, but something more nuanced. "Does that trouble you?" he asked, watching her closely. Madeline considered the question seriously. "No," she finally answered. "I thought it might that I might feel cheated of full justice. But I realized something as I read the judge's letter. Harrington's already lost the only battle that truly mattered." "How so?" Madeline gestured around them at their home, their son, the life they had built. "He tried to destroy all of this. To take my father's land, to silence me, to erase everything the Lawsons had worked for." Her smile was serene, free of bitterness. "But here we are. The land is thriving. Our family is growing. And Harrington died alone in a prison cell, having lost everything he valued: his wealth, his standing, his freedom." Mason rose, moving to stand before her, his hands gently framing her face. "You continue to amaze me, Madeline James. Most people would carry anger for a lifetime over what that man did." "I did for a while," she admitted. "But holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. My father taught me that, though it took me years to truly understand it." Mason's thumb brushed tenderly along her cheekbone. "Your father would be proud of the woman you've become. I know I am." Madeline leaned into his touch, savoring the connection between them that had only deepened with time and shared experiences. "I have something else to tell you," she said softly. "Something more important than Harrington's death." Mason's eyes searched hers, curiosity mingling with concern. "What is it?" Taking his hand, Madeline placed it gently against her stomach, still flat but harboring their secret. "Thomas is going to have a little brother or sister come spring." Joy bloomed across Mason's face, transforming his features in a way that still took Madeline's breath away. "You're certain?" She nodded, happiness bubbling up inside her like a clear spring. "Doctor Wilson confirmed it yesterday when I went into town for supplies. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Mason pulled her into a gentle embrace, mindful of the precious new life she carried. "Another child," he murmured against her hair, wonder in his voice. "Another piece of us in the world." "Another name to add to your will," Madeline teased, referring to the document Mason had insisted on creating after Thomas's birth, a will that carefully detailed his wishes for their property and holdings, with specific provisions for each family member. "You still think that's funny, don't you?" Mason asked, pulling back to look at her with mock sternness. "A man wants to provide for his family's future, and his wife teases him mercilessly." Madeline laughed, the sound drawing Thomas's attention from his blocks. "I think it's endearing. Besides, I remember what you wrote in that will, Mason James. Not just our names, but your heart. It was true. Mason's will wasn't just a dry legal document, but a testament to the life they had built and the love that sustained it." In careful, measured language, it spoke of his hopes for their children, his pride in their accomplishments, his unwavering faith in Madeline's strength and wisdom. It was, in its way, a love letter to the family he had once never expected to have. "Well," Mason said, a slight flush coloring his cheeks, "a man wants his family to know they were thought of, provided for." His voice softened. "Loved." "We know," Madeline assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "We've always known." Thomas, apparently feeling left out of the embrace, toddled over to tug at his father's trouser leg. "Up, Papa, up," Mason obliged, sweeping the boy into his arms and including him in their family circle. As they stood there together in the home they had built from both old dreams and new ones, Madeline felt the fullness of her life's journey, from a young woman who believed herself unlovable to a wife and mother whose heart expanded daily with the love she both gave and received. Outside, the Wyoming wind swept across fields ready for harvest, carrying the promise of changing seasons and new beginnings. Inside, wrapped in the arms of the man who had seen her value when she couldn't see it herself, Madeline James knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found her true home at last, not in a place, but in the hearts of those who loved her. And in the future, they would continue to build together, one day at a time,